Hello, and thank you very much for joining today's webinar. This is a topic that I am extremely passionate about, so hopefully my energy will shine through. We're going to talk about finding candidates that have Japanese language and/or cultural skills in the United States. So let me just give a quick little housekeeping to clarify who this webinar is for. This is for people who are involved as recruiters or HR, anybody who's involved in HR who needs to look for employees, whether it is for a recruiting company or a company that they actually work for. This is also, it could be for job seekers who are looking for their Japanese job, and maybe they're dealing with recruiting individuals who don't understand the Japanese component. This is something that you can later share with them to give them some information on this topic. And I will be focusing on candidates in the United States. I'm sure some of the things that I will mention could be applicable to other countries. Of course, in Japan, it's a little bit different, and I have not lived in Japan for a few years, so I cannot be a spokesperson for Japan, but I'm sure a few things that I say could also apply. Why am I doing this webinar? This is because I have had countless conversations with HR individuals who either they work at a local American recruiting company, but just all of a sudden they received a job ad for something that has a Japanese component and they've never done that before, so they don't know what it's like to find somebody who has Japanese language or cultural skills. But also, I've been trying to just teach people in general that there's a lot more that comes to knowing the language and the culture if you're trying to add that to a job description. So there's a lot of things I can say, and I'm happy to go over that today. Who am I? My name is Kasia. I started Ikigai Connections over 5 years ago, and I run a job board called Nihongo Jobs for the last 4 years. It has grown very slowly. Now I am to the point where I have about 12,000 followers who would like jobs in the United States related to Japanese. And also I have on average about 3,000 job ads on my job board that deal with Japan or Japanese, but focused on the United States or remote. I am actually somebody who started learning Japanese over 30 years ago. I am a huge fan of Japan. I lived there for 8 years, and all of my jobs are related to using Japanese language and cultural skills in Poland, Italy, and then the United States. So I am based in the US, and I am happy to dig deeper into sharing something that is very near and dear to my heart. So the agenda for today. First, we'll talk about the difficulties that people have hiring recruitment people have with finding Japanese English bilinguals in the United States. Then we'll talk about the solution. I'll give you 6 points to consider. Please take one or all to help you in your search. And lastly, I'll talk about the benefits if you do go through with these points. So let's begin. These are the things I hear from people who are looking for HR staff who are looking for candidates with these skills. First of all, the candidates, the applicants fit all the requirements except for the Japanese language component. So even though somebody has all the engineering skills, but that one thing with the Japanese is missing and they just don't know what to do. Or there are applicants who apply for the positions, but they may not be fluent enough. And this is something we will talk about in detail regarding the language component. Then there's recruitment professionals who look at resumes and see these crazy JET or MEXT or JLPT on these resumes, and they don't exactly know what that means. So we'll clarify that as well. And lastly, I do reach out. I have communication with a lot of individuals who are hiring, but just don't know where to search. They've tried the main job boards and they've tried, outreach, but they just can't find the candidates who have this tiny little component. So let's talk about the 6 steps of the solution process. So take any or all of these as you like, but one, we'll talk about the understanding the Japanese language component, Japanese cultural skills, and how actually they are also extremely important and oftentimes overlooked. Then we'll talk about Japanese language tests, which seem to be the absolute requirements for some positions, which I do not agree with. Next is improving your job descriptions. I'll just give a couple of ideas there. I'd also like to ask that you be open to potential candidates that you may not be thinking about right now. And lastly, optionally, to use the Nihongo Jobs job board that I offer. So let's get into the very first one. So Japanese language learning is extremely difficult. So if you have a job description and you're looking for Japanese language component, I would really like to let you understand what Japanese is about. So Japanese has three language systems called hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Let's say hiragana and katakana are like the alphabet. Just hiragana is more for Japanese native words and katakana is for foreign language words. Then kanji could be many, many thousands. You should know approximately 2,000 if you want to read the newspaper, is what they usually say. But there's a lot of kanji characters out there that are very difficult to read and memorize and even to write afterwards too. Then Japanese has, your levels can be very different depending on whether you are speaking in Japanese, listening, reading, writing, and of course, honorifics, which depends on the relationship that you are dealing with. So if you don't know anything about Japanese and you try to start learning, it's very difficult to be a very well-rounded individual who is good in all of these characteristics. So this is why I often ask, if you are writing a job description that has a language component to it, if you're requiring that something must be fluent or bilingual, that's not really clarifying exactly the level that we need to get to. You could say things, for example, on my job board, I mentioned the following language levels. One is not required, but appreciated. Then there's basic, intermediate, advanced, and native. So there's so many other ways you could narrow this down as well too, but that is the way that I believe could be very well helpful to the job seeker so they're able to place themselves in there. Now, fluent is a very strange word in a sense. I believe that when it comes to Japanese, you can't really say fluent because you could be better at speaking and listening. Like, for example, many professional interpreters I know who on the spot will interpret for you may not be able to write too much because their specialty isn't focused on reading and writing. It's more listening and speaking. Whereas I also know professional translators who are reading and writing all day. They can write kanji like crazy. But then if they start talking to you, they're going to just be very shy and not be able to converse because it's not their strength. It's not what they do all day. So I would really like recruitment professionals to be a little bit more open in terms of what skills are required in a role. I should also mention that for some reason, I'm not sure why this happens to people who study Japanese, but the more we study, we almost get very humble. And it just kind of starts off, it's the Japanese cultural way. And to be very honest, my understanding is that if you are humble and you're talking to a Japanese person and you say, oh no, my Japanese isn't that good yet, they actually take that and are impressed because they're like, oh, not only are they learning the language, but they also know the cultural nuances of trying to be humble. So that's a plus when it comes to a Japanese individual. And I often have to remind my job seekers to say, if they go to an interview and the interview is with a local person from the United States, they need to not be that humble because the local, perhaps American HR representative is not going to understand what that means. So that's also one thing I'd like to HR recruitment professionals should keep in mind. So if you are hiring for a role that requires Japanese fluency, I'd like you to find out from the hiring manager or whoever's in that department, is it mostly verbal, speaking and listening, or is it reading and writing, or is it all? Is it possible that maybe an intermediate level and up is better than native or advanced because the person will be able to learn and they can learn the terminology once they get to the company? Also find out if it's just internal communication, for example, if it's just within the company, within the local subsidiary and the headquarters, and if it's fine enough to not have perfect Japanese. Or if you are hiring for a role that requires this candidate to speak with a customer, for example, in Japanese, well, then maybe in that situation, yes, I agree, probably a higher level, advanced or native Japanese is probably going to be sufficient. However, I also know many, many people and companies who have hired people for those kinds of outward customer sales roles where their Japanese was not perfect, but they were quite good, intermediate and up. They were willing to learn, and they actually impressed the Japanese supplier or customer in such a way that they were like, wow, there is this non-Japanese person who's speaking to us, and wow, we can like communicate. So it's kind of like it's a very unique thing to have too. So I often share that with recruitment consultants as well. Now let's talk about the cultural knowledge. And I absolutely think this is so important. And so many people miss the concept that knowing the cultural skills of another country is just as important as language. So let's talk about some of these programs that I want you to kind of keep in mind as you're looking through resumes. A lot of people who are very much into Japanese language or culture, they go on high school or college study abroad programs. There's things like KCJS. I actually did that myself, Kyoto Consortium for Japanese Studies. JCMU, I'm familiar with it. It's here in Michigan, Japan Center for Michigan Universities. Other areas also have their own. Bridging Scholars is another one for college, and there's many more programs. Then there's, of course, the more famous, probably what you've seen on your resumes, the JET and the MEXT programs. JET program is something that a lot of individuals who want to work in Japan apply for. They get to go to Japan for 1 to 3, maybe 5 years, really depending on the situation. And they get to either become an ALT, where they teach English in the local schools, or they could become a CIR, which is a coordinator for international relations. A side note, CIR individuals are usually very good in Japanese because they've been thrown into governmental offices, prefectural offices, and they have to use business Japanese. So if you see CIR on a resume, that's usually a very good high level of Japanese language. Then there are MEXT programs, which is something that I personally did, where you get to go to a different, this is for upper education or higher education, to go to graduate school. I was able to receive a scholarship to do some research in a graduate program in Japan. So it also helped improve my Japanese language skills, even though I may not have been using it in a business setting, but academic is still extremely difficult. So if you find somebody who was in the MEXT program, I would dig deeper and find out what they did. Then we have all these other programs, and I just listed, I don't know, maybe 10% of them. There's the Fulbright, Tomodachi Initiative by the U.S.-Japan Council, Watanabe Scholarship, Kulkan, Sasakawa, Kakehashi Project, and so many more that are out there. And if you see on your resume that one of your candidates was on these programs, I highly recommend digging a little deeper and finding out. Of course, there's independent language programs. The IUC in Yokohama is one of the more famous, but there's also smaller schools, whether in Japan or in their own countries. And lastly, I'll mention that time in Japan, if somebody went even on a study abroad in high school or at college, that is excellent information that they can use at a company as well. So the concept of traveling around Japan is extremely difficult if you don't understand what to do. Etiquette, you take off your shoes before you go into a room, or how are, schools set up, and how are businesses run, and how are dinners done. All of this kind of forces you to read the room, as they say, or kuki or yomu, read the air in Japanese. People who have been in Japan have these soft skills, and they can bring that to your company culture, because they can assist with people who are maybe traveling to Japan for the first time, or communicating with Japanese people, and maybe they're being typical American, but it could come off as sounding rude in Japanese. So people with cultural skills and understand Japan, have lived there, can bring that to your company very much. So my 2 points are to be curious when you read resumes and be very open to cultural skills. Tests. This is my favorite topic, and I might be extremely opinionated on this, but everybody knows about the JLPT, which is the Japanese Language Proficiency Test. I actually created an article about it, which I will share with everybody after the recording, to please stop interviewing and hiring based solely on the JLPT. There are so many job descriptions out there that require a particular level, and I personally do not agree with that, because it is a very nuanced topic. The JLPT has 5 levels, and just because you reach the highest N1 does not necessarily mean that you are able to speak, because speaking is not tested. But I also say that even if somebody does not have the JLPT, does not mean that they cannot speak or understand the language, because the test itself is only conducted once a year outside of Japan and a couple of other countries. It is limited in testing centers, so people have to actually pay to travel and pay for hotels, and a lot of students who are studying Japanese may not afford this. And it's not necessarily business related. But again, don't get me wrong, I still recommend taking the JLPT. I think it's a great way to force you to learn the language, but just because you have it or just because you don't have it does not mean you are a bad or a good candidate for any job. So if you're interested, please take a look at my very lengthy and strongly opinionated article, which I just would like to share with the world. But the one test that is not mentioned by a lot of people is the BJT, Business Japanese Test. This is something that I have personally taken myself and feel that the content is very applicable to business. You learn phrases and dialogue for phone conversations and email correspondence, and this meeting happened, what happened in this situation. It's very applicable to business. In the US, you can take the test anytime. I believe there's about 3 centers in the US. Yes, you still have to fly to those, but you can take it anytime. Unfortunately, this test is not very well known by either job seekers or companies. So if anybody is watching this video and if you have a connection with the BJT, please let me know. I'd love to communicate with them because this test, I believe, should be better well known in the business world. So to summarize, it's great if a candidate has the test, but it's still not a guarantee that they are a fit or not a fit. And please do not require it in your job descriptions. Number 4, improving job descriptions. As we talked about in the first 3 solutions, see if you can update your JD to have the fluency, the bilingual aspect a little bit more clarified for the job seekers that are looking. Don't forget that they may be humble, and if they see something that is fluent, they'll probably not apply. And so therefore you are missing out on a lot of candidates who just don't feel that because Japanese is hard to learn. I'd also like to add benefits. And especially if you represent a Japanese headquartered company, I've noticed that generally speaking, the Japan headquartered companies do not provide any benefits information in the job description itself. That a lot of the times the benefits are comparably better than our counterparts. So if you can add anything, please do, whether it's the 401k match, the health insurance, the other benefits that come with life insurance and other insurance types. Also, if there's even anything like, free lunch on Fridays or Costco memberships or gym memberships or language training, all of that I think is wonderful to add to the benefits. And lastly, the Japan trip opportunities I think are going to be a big plus for people who are studying Japan or Japanese or involved with Japan and the culture. So if you have a short-term business trip coming up or an expat assignment that you think would be possible in this role, definitely something to add. Number 5, I would like, if I had a dream, that every recruiting individual could consider a few more, just expand their search just to a few extra candidates. I think that would be wonderful. There is a big disconnect in the United States from when I speak with schools and I tour and speak to people who are studying Japanese. Very, very few people believe they can actually find a job with their Japanese. So that means they're taking Japanese courses because they're interested, they like it, they want to learn. They go to Japan because they think it's kind of like a vacation, right? But they don't realize that there is a connection with those skills and a career. So once they start seeing that there are opportunities with Japanese language and or cultural skills, they're not prepared. They don't know what the business terminology is in the companies. They don't really know what to do. So I would really like to ask that you are open to hiring people who may need that extra boost to help support them in the middle. Of course, I do have a training program called Japanese Jobs 200. If you're interested in that, just let me know. It's also on my website. But it's just a way to train people who have the language and the cultural component, but just needs to be applied to the business world. Keep in mind that the terminology that you use in your company, regardless of industry, is most likely not taught in any school. So if you want somebody who's perfectly fluent, then you're going to miss out on a lot of people who just don't know what your industry lingo is like. And maybe they learned basic Japanese grammar and basic honorifics, but they just don't feel that they can make that jump. So if you are able to have somebody who maybe isn't advanced enough for you, but in intermediate, let's say they have 3 years of college and they've reached intermediate level, then you can say, all right, we would like for you to learn on the job so you can eventually get to the advanced position in this role. And I think that would be something that personally speaking, if I was to be paid to learn Japanese, that would be a dream come true. So consider that in your hiring as well too. So be open to great candidates, especially if they have the desire to learn. Please be patient. They might just need a little bit of time in the beginning to learn the terminology and the culture and be willing to train. And lastly, of course, I'd like to put a plug in for my job board. I have over 12,000 followers. They would love to use their Japanese language and cultural skills. They just need an opportunity and some training. I have a very easy 3-step process. You just register your email, you add the job description. Of course, I have you answer a few questions specifically regarding the Japanese language, the visa, etc., etc. And you can purchase them for either 15 days or 30 days. Your job ad gets immediately posted to LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Well, Twitter now and X, they just stopped that possibility, so it just takes a few hours for me to do that. And of course, your job ad gets added to the weekly job seeker newsletter on Thursdays, and there's a weekly LinkedIn newsletter on Tuesdays as well. So if you are able to do any of those 6 ideas, I really believe it'll be beneficial in your search. But if you don't, this is what I think will continue happening. You will continue getting applicants without the language skill component because it's just confusing. Maybe it's not clear in the job description. Again, they're too humble to apply because they don't feel that they'll be able to make that language level. You might wait forever for a perfect hire if your expectation is they must be absolutely fluent. Again, I believe you should lower your standards just a little bit. You might have a confused new hire if they're not really sure if the job description is fully accurate with the language level. Maybe what actually has happened a lot in the past that I've heard of is that the job description required advanced, but then when the person actually came to the job, there was very little Japanese that was required. So there's a mismatch there, and perhaps they didn't feel their Japanese language skills were actually being pushed to the limit. So a little bit of a disappointment. But of course, if you have this kind of, confusion, maybe an unsatisfied internal group because of the miscommunications, and of course, a turnover risk because your job description didn't really match what you needed. But if you do take any of these tips that I suggested, I really believe you can find a motivated new hire. Because a lot of times these people excel in bridging cultures. They want to be that bridge between the US and Japan. They want to collaborate. They want to help with communication. And you can also be seen as a very global company because you are using this kakehashi, which means bridge in Japanese, to represent both cultures. You may have less cultural issues, and as a result, you have better ROI for your hiring decision. So that is it for me today. I'm going to stop the recording momentarily, and for the people who stay longer, I'll have a Q&A session. But I wanted to thank you. I'm driven to consistently improve the job board so that it continues to bridge the gap between both the job seekers who just want this opportunity and these globally successful recruiters and employers who know they need these people to help bridge these gaps between maybe Japan, the US, and the world. So thank you again, and I look forward to staying in touch with you.